Gorman Gray said this in a 2009 debate.
The late Dr. Henry Morris, to whom all creationists, including me, owe such a deep debt of gratitude. On a bus tour of the Grand Canyon area, someone asked him, what are the most difficult scientific problems creationists have? His answer was, light from distant galaxies and radioisotope ratios in Earth's crust. I mentioned that to Danny Faulkner, a well-known young Earth Creationist astronomer, and queried him, and what are the most difficult problems for us today, 15 years later? He said, laughing, light from distant galaxies and radioisotope ratios in the Earth's crust. Either of these phenomena requires billions of years to occur, not a good match for a 6,000-year-old universe.
In his book, Age of the Universe, What Are the Biblical Limits?, he shows that the problem was inaccurate translation. Here is an analogy. Suppose 2,000 years from now all digital and tape recordings from our time have disintegrated, but archaeologists still find fragments of paper. A book cover is found titled Biography of Clark Gable, with all the pages torn out except for a small scrap that reads, "A simple man, he made his own bed every day and still made it in a competitive industry." In that future time, the world is speaking a mix of Hindi and Mandarin. Only a few scholars study English. Not realizing that the author was trying to be clever, they interpret this sentence to mean Clark Gable was a carpenter who built beds and was undeterred by the success of other bed builders. That view is unquestioned for many years until a picture is found that shows Clark Gable in It Happened One Night. Does this mean he was an actor, not a carpenter? The scholars argue that a man who builds a new bed for himself every day while selling the old ones in a competitive market has no time for acting. Then another picture is found showing Clark Gable in red dust, and people begin to laugh at the English scholars. Clearly he was a famous actor. Some scholars chose to compromise, saying he built beds for a time and acted for a time, but the others stick to their guns. They have it in writing in a biography of Clark Gable. He made his own bed every day. Obviously, the problem is understanding the use of the word made. The intended meaning of the sentence is, a simple man, he straightened his own bed covers every day after sleeping in them, and still achieved success in a competitive industry. Interpreted rightly, there is no conflict with the other evidence showing him to be an actor, and no need to compromise. Let's go through the creation verses. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Shamayim means heaven, either the universe or the sky, depending on the context. Here it is used the way David did in Psalm 8:3, when he writes, "Your heavens, the moon and stars." The Hebrew word bara is used, which means only one thing, create. So the first thing that God did was create the universe of stars, nebulas, and planets, including Earth. This is not a summary of what follows, which describes his working on the Earth to create the biosphere. The only place in the creation story in which the planet Earth is created is verse 1. So it exists fully formed, but is a dead planet, like all the others astronomers have found. Formless is a mistranslation of tohu in verse 2. Tohu wabahu means an empty wasteland in this context, and darkness was on the surface of the deep ocean. Job 38:9 says, God had covered the earth with clouds, wrapping it in thick darkness. If that does not refer to verse 2, when was it? These were water clouds, unlike the thick clouds of gas that still enclose Venus, Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, and Neptune. So Earth was a solid planet with a deep ocean covered with thick, wet, dark clouds. How long it was like that, the Bible does not say. It could be any amount of time, but at least long enough for starlight from the farthest galaxies to reach Earth, and isotope ratios to develop inside it. Of course, God exists outside of time. Then verse 2 says, The Spirit of God moved on the face of the waters. From here on, everything is described from a viewpoint on the surface of the earth. This is not an unusual idea. R.K. Harrison wrote in his Introduction to the Old Testament in 1969 that it was as though the writer were actually on the earth at the time in a position to record the developing phases of created life as he experienced them. As long as darkness on the ocean's surface continued, a first day was impossible. So when verse 3 says, "Let there be light," the clouds were thinned enough to allow a little sunlight to the surface, enough to be able to discern the evening and morning in verse 5. Many have assumed there was suddenly all over cosmic light, without a point source like the sun. Gorman Gray notes that this would not allow an evening anywhere, and yet there was evening and morning the first day. In verses 6 and 7, God lifted the clouds off the ocean of water covering the earth, producing our atmosphere. Here it is called the rakia, or expanse. If this is not the atmosphere, then there is no record of it being made in the creation account. Lifting a thick cloud covering to the height clouds begin today, about 6,500 feet, would further thin the clouds by making the same volume cover a larger area. In verse 8, God called it the sky, and there was the second day. In verses 9 and 10, the global ocean covering the earth parted to reveal dry land. Now that there was dry land, light, and water, verses 11 and 12 say, God called forth plants of all kinds to sprout from the ground. Verse 13 says that was the third day. The clouds surrounding the earth were still in place. There was just enough light for a viewer on the surface of earth to tell day from night, but in verses 14 to 18, on the fourth day, the cloud cover was dissipated to reveal the sun, moon, and stars, giving the earth full daylight. Genesis 1:16 and 17 are without doubt the main sources of the translation controversy, so we will look at them closer. Remember the Hebrew word bara in the first verse, when God created the universe? In verse 16 there is a different word, asa. It has lots of meanings, 74 in fact, including do and bring forth, as well as make. Biblical scholar Bernard Northrop says, asa is consistently used for work which is performed on existing materials. Asa is used in Jonah 1:9, where it says, the God of heaven made the sea and dry land. We already know the ocean was parted to reveal the dry land, and it is the same here, where the cloud cover was dissipated to reveal the sun, moon, and stars. Bring forth is probably the closest English translation in this case, and Gorman Gray is hardly the first to recognize it. In a book published in 1871 that is still widely used today, Jameson, Fawcett, and Brown, who are known as conservative and orthodox teachers of the Christian faith, wrote, the atmosphere being completely purified, the sun, moon, and stars were for the first time unveiled in all their glory in the cloudless sky, and they are described as in the firmament, which to the eye they appear to be, though we know they are really at vast distances from it. R.K. Harrison agrees, assuming a viewer on the surface of the earth. From such a standpoint, the heavenly bodies would only become visible when the dense cloud covering of the earth had dispersed to a large extent. Verse 17 is usually translated to say some form of, God put them in the sky to give light to the earth. The Hebrew word nathan most often means give in the Bible. It can also mean put, set, make, deliver, appoint, and many other things. Bernard Northrop says that in this verse it is used in the sense of appointing, the way Nathan is used in Genesis 41:41, when Pharaoh appointed Joseph over all Egypt. In the context of verses 14 to 18, it is clear to all these men that it talks about unveiling the sun, moon, and stars, and designating them as lights for the earth, rather than creating them. This becomes even more apparent when we see in verse 20 that birds fly in the same place as in verse 17, the rakia, or expanse, which is the atmosphere in the heavens, shamayim. On day 5, in verses 20 to 22, God created sea creatures and birds. On day 6, in verses 24 and 25, he created land animals. Lastly, he created man, using the Hebrew word bara in verse 27, while he fashioned man in his own image, using the Hebrew word asa in verse 26. So that's it. Nothing complicated and no conflict with distant starlight or radioisotopes. That is the Young Biosphere Creation model, authored by Gorman Gray. Like the rest of the universe, the age of planet Earth is not disclosed in Genesis 1:1. Exodus 20:11 superficially seems to tell a different story. It is usually translated, "For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, the sea, and all that is in them." The King James Version puts the first in italics to show that it is not in the original Hebrew, and Young's literal translation goes a step further by correctly omitting it. Bernard Northrop agrees, and considers the mistranslation of this verse as a pivotal error that has led many astray. Once again, the word asa was misleadingly translated made, rather than working on existing material, while heaven and earth should use their alternate meanings of sky and land to fit the third part, the sea. If you think about it, it does not make sense to say God created the planet Earth and the sea, because the sea is included in the earth. The correct translation is, "For 6 days the Lord worked on the air, the land, and the sea, and all that is in them." And that is a good summary of the creation account in Genesis. Why was all this not corrected before? In the analogy with Clark Gable, no one knew there was a conflict with the biography until movie posters were found. Likewise, the conflict with astronomy and radioisotope ratios prompted Gorman Gray to re-examine the text. The good news is that, rightly translated, Genesis is in sync with scientific evidence. On the other hand, over the last 40 years, scientific evidence has accumulated to show that origin of life and macroevolution by natural processes alone are physically impossible. With the age of the universe and Earth no longer an issue, creationists can be done with defending a difficult position and unite in bringing down evolution theory, which only survives by bluster. But as obvious as this translation is, Jesus warned us what would happen with new ideas. New wine in old wineskins would make them burst, and that is often the response to young biosphere creation. Gorman Gray wrote in response to a critic, "Sometimes I wonder if young Earth creation people would prefer the misery of defending a 10,000-year-old universe and Earth rather than accept this utterly simple solution, which is scripturally and scientifically sound. This simple interpretation, understandable to small children, does not require an old universe, but allows it, and thereby solves all the creationists' major problems." Amen.